Welcome everyone to the 6th annual State of the Unions event organized by GMF and the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. I'm Louise Langeby. I'm the Deputy Director of GMF Brussels, and delighted to welcome you all here to this event today, where we'll have a back-to-back discussion looking at the 2024 US elections and the resilience of the transatlantic relationship at this time of turbulence. We're really excited to bring together so many important transatlantic voices today and to continue this long-standing convening partnership that we have with FEPS. Our first session today will look at Decoding US Politics 2024, specifically high stakes and high expectations. I'm delighted to have Ines Pohl with us today to moderate the session. Ines is a Washington Bureau Chief of Deutsche Welle. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Ines, and thank you all so much for being with us.
Thank you, Louise, very much, and everyone who is watching us and listening to us. It's indeed very exciting times, and it's wonderful to work with GMF together. I really have a long-standing work relationship with the German Marshall Fund, and it's so enriching. So thank you all. I will do a very brief introduction of our distinct guests this morning and this afternoon. So this is Emily Cain. She's the former executive director of Emily's List. I think that's all what everybody needs to know. Emily, it's fantastic that you're making time for this discussion. Then there is Rachael Dean Wilson. I'm sure everybody knows her. She has been moderating me. So Rachael, payback time. She's the managing director for US Politics and Politics Analysis here at the GMF. And then we have Joe Pounder. He's the CEO of Bullpen, of the Bullpen Strategy Group, an expert in many regards, but also on communication strategy. Joe, and my first question goes to you. I'm a journalist working with an international audience, and I start with a very personal question. How can I explain to the rest of the world what is going on in this country? You have 2 minutes.
Wow. Way to begin with a big topic early here on the East Coast of the United States. Well, first off, thank you for the opportunity to be here and for this important panel discussion. You know, it's a big topic a year out from the election, when we have I think, deeply divided country, but also narrowly divided country as well, where we have possibility of two candidates at the top of the ticket in Joe Biden and Donald Trump, who have very strong base support and whatnot. And we'll probably be talking to mostly those bases over the next year. And then we also have a Congress where the majorities are very small. So at this point in the election, a year out, we have the maximum array of possibilities next November of Congress switching, the House switching, the Senate switching, and the White House switching. And this election has many lives to live, and it's going to be a very active campaign. I do think there's a little bit of conventional wisdom here, where it's not going to be maybe the most uplifting campaign that we've seen in recent modern history and whatnot, in which both candidates will be trying to make it a referendum on the other side in a closely divided country. But at the end of the day, I think we have a lot of lives to live in this election, and I think it's going to be a very nuanced election. It's going to be a very surprising election at the end of the day.
Thanks for this first statement, Joe. Emily, I would like to go to you as a little bit of as a beginning of this introduction. We have two very old candidates. What does that mean for the younger voting body? Maybe you can talk a little bit about their issues and what to expect when it comes to the voter outcome in that regard.
Thank you. And thank you for having me to the German Marshall Fund. I was a Marshall Memorial Fellow in 2007, which seems like a very long time ago, but it's an experience that really has shaped my life and my look at the world. And as I'm very flattered that you're asking me about young voters, as someone who isn't always in that category. But I think when we look at the presidential election, Joe Biden has been focusing on issues that young voters very clearly care about: climate change, gun safety, women's reproductive health care. He has been leading on those issues very upfront and very unapologetically. Young voters notoriously don't like to be partisan. They don't like to be labeled as a Democrat or as a Republican. But what they do want, they do care about actual issues. They care about things. They care about more than just student debt, which is another area Joe Biden has taken real action on. He has a record to run on. And I think the point that Joe made about both candidates sort of running against each other, the advantage Joe Biden has is he can run not just against Donald Trump and sort of with a caution of, you don't want that guy back again for all of the reasons. He also has a positive record to run on that I think will bring him strength in the new year. As for age, we all knew how old Joe Biden was when we elected him before. We all knew how old Donald Trump was when he got elected. I think that's one of those things that is going to be thrown around as if it really matters, but what's going to actually matter is how the candidates show up, how they articulate themselves, and the amount of trust they can build among that middle group that's not either of their base, but sort of those swing voters. People call them double haters, people who kind of hate Joe Biden and kind of hate Donald Trump. Those people are really going to decide this election. And I think the good news is, for me, Joe Biden has a record to run on and a story to tell.
Emily, I would like to have a follow-up in that regard. I agree with you. He indeed, Joe Biden, really did a lot of things which will be very good, let's put it that way, for the younger generation. We will probably see the outcome over the next 30, 40, 50 years. But it doesn't look like, at least at the moment, that the younger generation really sees it that way.
You know, I think polls, which it's been kind of on a whiplash polling ride lately. It's like a really terrible roller coaster, and I don't like roller coasters. But this far out from the election, a colleague of mine at Third Way has a really great way of putting it. He said, polls right now are about a referendum on how you feel, not about how you're going to vote. It's too far away. We don't know how people are really going to vote next year. And I think Joe Biden has time to tell that story more effectively in the next year, not just by himself, but through surrogates of all ages across the country, with a quite strong group of governors that are going to be out there saying about the good things happening in their states, whether with infrastructure and climate change, because of the things that the Biden administration has done. And I think we are going to, the challenge for the Biden campaign is to make it not just about not electing Donald Trump, right? And again, they have a story to tell, but it will be a challenge. And it cannot go unstated that really we have a number of spoiler third-party candidates percolating out there, right? We have RFK, we have Cornel West, we have Jill Stein, who spoiled it the last time we got Donald Trump. And we also have this potential of a well-funded, yet to be named no labels party candidate, all of which would be spoilers for Donald Trump, in my opinion.
Thank you. Rachael, I'd like to bring you in and then we dig a little deeper in different topics. My question to you as an opening question would be, if Trump would be elected, State Department and the Defense Department probably will made up with MAGA nationalists. We are here at the German Marshall Fund in kind of an international setting. How would that determine the future of national security and the future of the security in also in Europe?
Well, right now, in regard to that, we're hearing a lot of talk. There's obviously been a lot of planning going on, both within the Trump campaign, as to how to avoid what they see as like problems with the last administration, with bringing in more, quote, moderate Republicans, which I don't even believe is the right way to talk about these people who are incredibly conservative, but just not blindly loyal to the MAGA thinking and to Donald Trump. But so there's some planning going on at the Heritage Foundation to figure out, we've seen reporting on it this week, how to kind of vet people ahead of time. And then there's also a project within the Trump campaign. I think it remains to be seen what is done with those projects and how effective they will be. But it's a consequential election. You can't understate or overstate that. But I also don't think we're there yet. We're so focused and ready to get to Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, which is about the most uninspiring matchup we could come to in this state for most Americans. It's kind of the movie no one, like, the sequel no one asked for here. And so I encourage, I think it would be helpful to have the conversation where we take a step back and look at, okay, we still have a primary election in the Republican side that needs to take place. And that while this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of Trump's inevitability, I get it, I get the polls. But I did pull this up this morning, which I think is a fun trip down memory lane, taking everyone back to November 2007. It was actually November 16th, 2007, pulled a headline: Clinton sustains huge lead in Democratic nomination race, leads Obama by 27 points in new poll. We all know like the wild ride that happened from there on the Democratic side in the primary. There are a lot of differences between what's happening now and what happened in 2007, 2008. But this narrative of inevitability is something that, the media elites, party elites latched onto at that point, and it did not serve them well. And so I caution us all to at least let these primaries play out.
Thank you. I will invite, or would like to invite, our audience to join this conversation. We have like 20 minutes or so when we will be talking with ourselves, and then we will turn to your questions. Please use the chat function from Zoom if you want to address any question or also just a statement. Let's dig a little bit with the Republicans. Joe, I would come to you for their questions. There are, and Rachel just talked about it, there are primaries. I mean, it's not decided yet. There are others who want to challenge Trump. For a long time, it seemed as if the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, would have a chance. Doesn't very much look like it anymore. And then there is Nikki Haley. She is now, at least from some of my colleagues, seen as the possible winner of that race. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the chances that another person really will be running and not Donald Trump for the Republican Party.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And Rachel's exactly right. Like, I think the conventional wisdom here in DC has been, this is a little bit of a like primary in name only, a Potemkin primary, so to speak, where we're all just on the road to the inevitable of Donald Trump winning this nomination. I think it's important to step back to where did we begin? And we tend to think of these primaries in tiers. Tier one, when we started a year out ago, at the beginning of the year, was always Donald Trump if he decided to run again. And then our tier two would have been someone like Governor Ron DeSantis, popular in Florida, had a great session, had a lot of money raised, former Vice President Mike Pence. And then tier three was kind of like everyone else, former Governor Nikki Haley, Senator Tim Scott, and so forth. And what we've seen is just a change in the tiers, so to speak, from the polling. We still have Donald Trump in clearly a front-running position. I do think it's a little bit of his primary to lose at this point. But in tier two, we have Governor DeSantis still, who has the money to be in second at this point, but has underperformed, which I think most people recognize to date and so forth. And now in tier two, we have former Governor Nikki Haley, who has performed really well at the debates, is now investing in the early states in Iowa and New Hampshire. She's in second in most of the state polls at this point, seems to be the momentum candidate. And previously in Republican primaries, we've seen that momentum candidate kind of come and go. There was a point where Newt Gingrich looked like he was going to win the primary in 2012, but then he's gone by the next debate performance. That clearly hasn't happened with Nikki. And I do think there's still some lives to live in this Republican primary. Remember, Iowa is not until January 15th next year, and then we have New Hampshire afterwards. Governor DeSantis has made a considerable investment in Iowa and on the ground there. The team around him is the same team that helped Ted Cruz win that in 2016. So he has made the investment. He is putting all of it on Iowa. So it remains to be seen about that. And then Nikki is gaining momentum. But I think what is also true is most of those campaigns entered into this race thinking that Donald Trump was probably capped around 30 to 33% of the Republican electorate. And what we have found is with every indictment, every trial, and so to speak, that number has only risen. And I think that has surprised a lot of the other candidates, where now you're looking at these state polls and you're seeing him at 40 to over 50%. And I do think something that's underappreciated, especially I think very important for an international audience, is remember the Republican primary is a race for the majority of the delegates voting at the convention next summer. Whoever gets the most delegates wins the nomination at the end of the day. And all of these states and the territories that vote have different rules for how they award those delegates. And those rules are determined not by a central party, but by the state parties. And what we've seen over the last year is the Trump campaign, I will give them credit, is actually running probably a better campaign than they did in 16 and 20. And what they have done over the last 6 or 7 months is systematically change some of those rules for awarding delegates. So for example, in a state like California, which while not a Republican state, still has a large number of Republican delegates at the end of the day to award to the convention. It has gone from a proportional system by congressional district, which would help all the candidates like Nikki, Ron DeSantis, and so forth, to now if a candidate gets above 50%, they win all the delegates. It's a huge haul for them. And that's because the Trump campaign moved to change those rules earlier this year. And Donald Trump, by all polls in California, is above 50% right now. So, this could be drawn out, but could it also be very quick because of the way the delegates are awarded? I do think it's important for Governor DeSantis and for Nikki Haley to have strong finishes in Iowa. I did do the Rubio presidential campaign in 2016, and we were mired in single digits, to Rachel's point, at this point in Iowa. And then we got into a third with the strong double digits. So Iowa does change in the last 2 to 3 weeks. So we all need to be very tuned in to what might happen.
Yeah, thank you for this little math. It's so complicated in the United States, and it's nearly impossible to explain it, not only, I think, to an international audience, but also to non-experts, how the Electoral College and how all this works. So thanks for that background. I would like to stick a little bit with the Republican Party. I find it interesting that when it comes to the Senate on the GOP side, on the one hand, they do support Donald Trump, but when it comes to foreign policy matters like Ukraine or the support of Israel, they rather kind of align with Biden. What does this tell us about this Republican Party? Rachel or Emily, who wants to jump in here? Emily first.
I would say I think this question sort of builds on the last one pretty well, because I know I watched the Republican debate last week. I'm not really sure why I did that. I really was just sort of curious. I hadn't really dug in yet. And what I would say is that we're watching a bunch of people who are hoping in some way Donald Trump goes away, right? Whether he fumbles too much, which I think he's done a million times, but clearly they don't. He is consistently polling, in some cases, 50 and 60% of Republican voters. And it feels almost like a farce watching sort of something theatrical when we watch these other candidates try to make a name for themselves. But when we think about what's happening there, and then we look at the Congress, right? And I think it's the Senate, but also the House. What you have right now is a democratically controlled White House. You have a democratically controlled Senate, though it is very tight, and it is independents that really make up the top end of the Democratic majority. And you have a House that sort of isn't really controlled by anybody, right? Technically, the Republicans have the math. Yesterday, they passed a continuing resolution to keep the government open, which is another thing we do in America, almost shut the government down every few months. And we have a situation where more Democrats than Republicans actually voted to do that. They're the reason that the bill passed. So we have a situation where Democrats are in the White House and the Senate, and in the House, you have the Democrats leading from the minority, where normally it's the majority party working to get things done. And in this case, it's the majority party working to tear it apart. And so when you have this challenge in the Senate of the Senate, who used to be sort of the problem body, right, where things would get stuck there. Now you have a bunch of senators sitting around being like, can we just do something? Like, can they send us something we can actually pass? And I think we have whether it's international conversations that have shifted, right? Whether the voice that the Republican Party now gives to Russia, which I'm old enough to remember, Reagan and pushing back on communism around the world. And you have this sort of strange alliances coming up everywhere. I think it only adds to the roller coaster that we're headed into in 2024.
Rachael, explain me, where are the moderate, some might say sane Republicans in the discourse, in the Republican political discourse and decision making?
Yeah, so this also builds on your last question, which I think it's really important to note that two-party system means that if you only have two parties, there is going to be a wide range of opinions on a variety of issues. Sure, most Republicans are going to say that pro business policies. We're going to say that it used to be that we would be pretty strong on the national security front, very much in the McCain mold. The Reagan mold has been talked about recently. But I think but there's always been room for, you look at Rand Paul, who's been around for a long time, like he never fell into the McCain mold of national security. And so what you're seeing is truly the full spectrum. Now, there used to be more agreement on the national security space, but we're debating about this. We're either going MAGA Republican, isolationist kind of populist policies that are America first, or the party is going to go with a more traditional peace through strength kind of direction. And so those views can live within the party, but at some point we will have a nominee and they will have a policy. That does not mean every lawmaker that considers themselves a Republican will be in lockstep with that policy. But it does mean that's the general direction of the party. So that conversation is being had now. What you see on the Hill is that the Senate senators are elected every 6 years. And so there isn't the turnover that you see on the House side with elections every 2 years. And so it is the more deliberative body. And so you see those senators and those senators are a little more insulated from kind of the whims of movements on these issues. So I do think that's important to know.
Joe, any thoughts on that? I saw your head moving.
Yeah, I think we're actually at a very unique time in the way of leadership in Congress on both the Senate and the House side. They have lost a lot of leverage in regards to the fact that their majorities are just so small. And at this point, when you see a president's approval rating down and mired in the 30s, it's generally considered to be a weaker White House at the end of the day. And when you have that equation at a time of great national security crisis in the world, those two don't really align all too well, when the fact is, like, you have a lot of domestic politics now getting intertwined with foreign aid to Israel, aid to Ukraine, and so forth, and the ability of one senator or 5 congressmen to change the direction of that conversation. At the same time, I think both parties are dealing with their own foreign policy issues, Ukraine to Republicans, Israel to Democrats. At the same time, both parties, unlike what we've seen in the last 20 years in the United States, are dealing with real strains of populism that are creating different centers for the party and changing what would normally be a very foreign policy consensus country: defeat the Russians, support Ukraine, and so forth, now mired in, well, we also have to do border security and so forth, and we need to link that and whatnot. That's why I think, an outcome for foreign policy that might be very good ultimately out of this election is, no matter who takes the House or Senate, having larger majorities to be able to leverage and actually get things done and build that consensus. But we have this unique ability where our Congress deeply divided at a time of where we're seeing national security crisis like we haven't seen probably since 9/11.
Can I jump in on just one thing that I think is really important that Joe said, which is this connection between domestic issues and international issues that does seem to be newer, right? It seems to be sort of a new thing. And a great example is abortion, right? Where in the United States Senate, you have one senator holding up hundreds of military appointments because he doesn't like that the military would deliver abortion as healthcare to those who need it. And it is making people on all sides very mad, but it also really speaks to, I think, the themes we saw in the Republican debate, things we're seeing in headlines across the country, which is this sort of conflation. There's no separation anymore of like, well, this is in one bucket, we're going to deal with it, or this is in another bucket. They're all getting tied together. And I think the issue of abortion particularly has Republicans in knots, right? We saw that play out in the debate last week with a sort of quite an array of answers from all of the candidates. We saw abortion be a winning issue in elections in Virginia and in Ohio and in Kentucky just a week ago. And I think going into the next year, that's going to continue to happen. This sort of mix up, right, of things that used to live in different areas. And I think abortion is going to be front and center on that. And I think it will be a winning issue for Democrats.
Looks like it, right? We have another 5 minutes or so for us here, and then we open up for the questions from our audience. We already got some great questions. You can use the Zoom chat function to put in your questions. My last question will be, we already kind of scratched that possibility of a third candidate, of a no labels candidate. We talked about Jill Stein. I would like you guys to tell me how serious Joe Manchin might be for the Democrats. The West Virginia senator whose term is running out, will he be running? What kind of game changer might this be? Anybody wants to answer this question before we move on to our Rachael? Go ahead.
I can jump in. I'm seeing hesitation on the other side, so I'm happy to jump in. He didn't say no, so I'm going to let that outright. So I'm going to let that speak for itself. Who knows? But you know, I do think if there was someone of that caliber, that's a real game changer from kind of the efforts we saw previously with like Mindy Finn and Evan. Thank you. Yes, McMullen, of course. How could I forget? You know, these were basically never had run for national public office. So I do think that would change the equation. But I can't speak to the seriousness or Manchin's thoughts on this.
Emily?
I work on this, and I think, as I said earlier, all of these third-party candidates are, to me, spoilers for Donald Trump, right? You can take them one at a time and say, who do they pull from more or less? But what we know is that Donald Trump's floor and ceiling is not that different, right? His voters are going to vote for him. And as you heard Joe mention earlier, Biden has a pretty strong base too. And it's that sort of window of people who are grumpy about both sides that decided last time when it was a straight up, Trump-Biden race. They chose Biden. I think they would again. When we think about Joe Manchin, I mean, No Labels has more than telegraphed very clearly in recent weeks that they intend to put a Republican on the top of the ticket because they believe that is how they have a better chance of spoiling the election. They are making plans for what is called the contingent election. And for our international audience, that is something that is worth Googling, but probably basically throws the election to the US House, and every state delegation gets one vote. The Republicans, under every scenario, will still control the number of state delegations. So essentially throwing the US presidential election to the US House for Republicans to decide, or an alliance of some kind. That to me is terrifying. But with No Labels saying that we put a Republican at the top of the ticket, I have a very hard time imagining Joe Manchin being anybody's number two. Right. He has served admirably from West Virginia. I was sorry to hear that he would not run again. He has been a strong voice on so many issues. He says he's touring the country to see what people need to try to rebuild the middle. I think he's genuine about wanting to rebuild the middle, and I think he would find a lot of people who want to do that with him, but I do not think he will find support, and he certainly is smart enough to look at all of the scenarios and know there's no path to winning on a third-party ticket. There's no record of it in recent history, and there's nothing extraordinary about this moment that makes it one that seems like a third party could actually win.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
no,
There's a threat of a third. There's a threat of a possible third candidate or no label candidate, which might weaken the Democrats, which might weaken Joe Biden. But there's also the fight within the Democratic Party or the Democrats themselves. And I will bring in the question here from Flavio Brunoli, if I pronounce it right. What's your opinion on the dissent inside the Biden administration on the president's strategy on the Middle East? Healthy democratic debate or worrying fragmentation in the Democratic front? I think that's a very important issue. We see that many Arab Americans are turning their back on Joe Biden. We actually did a report out in Dearborn, Michigan, about that topic, and they said they rather would have Donald Trump in office than voting for Joe Biden, because he's not taking enough care of, and I quote this here, the human rights violations in Gaza. So that definitely could be a problem for President Biden. Joe, what do you say to that?
Yeah, well, I'm no expert on internal Democratic politics on that side, but I do think from an overall standpoint, what is, I think, keeping me up at night if I'm the White House political director is the strength of the coalition of voters around Joe Biden. You know, we've seen within the polling data to date that there is a weakening within the Biden coalition among Hispanic voters, Black voters, young voters, across the board, a lack of, enthusiasm at this point. There's a while for it to come back and whatnot. I do think what this debate is having, the effect it's having on the Democratic Party, is to continue to fracture that coalition, especially among, I would say it's probably more young voters than maybe Arab American voters at the end of the day. But if I was the White House, the effect that this is having from a political standpoint is probably worrisome in the way of the coalition that will show up next November. So it's something to manage. That being said, I think from just a foreign policy standpoint, Israel is a consensus point, very much so within the Republican Party at the end of the day. So I still think we have that context. As we were noting earlier, you saw all the House and Senate leadership at the rally for Israel yesterday, which was a really great moment to see just from a foreign policy, consensus. The country is united and whatnot. So that was great to see, as opposed to the images we've seen across the country for the past couple of weeks and whatnot. So I do think that's an overall still consensus position. But if I'm the White House, I am watching very closely the impact that this is debate and other voices within the Democratic Party, from a Tlaib to an Omar, are having from that position. And it does give, I think, Republicans leverage going forward throughout the rest of the campaign.
Thank you. Dirk Wouters, he's the chairman of the America-Europe Fund in Leuven in Belgium. He asked, what can still be done before the election on both sides to strengthen and solidify the transatlantic relationship? Rachel, I would like to pass this question to you. It's a great question.
It's a great question. And unfortunately, when we get into US politics, sometimes foreign policy and our alliances in particular kind of go out the window, and we're really focusing on domestic politics. Given Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas conflict, that will not be the case this go around, but it does depend. We're in this moment right now where it's very front and center, but these things have a way of fading as we get closer to election, and it normalizes, becomes the new normal. And so on the foreign policy and international stage, it really matters timing of these conflicts and timing of developments in these conflicts, how much of an impact they have on the actual outcome. How to bolster transatlantic relations now. I think it's important to continue to make the case about why we need to support Ukraine funding what that looks like, how it has an economic impact on the United States that's incredibly positive. And that is a message that our allies can help bring here, and that our members of Congress that support Ukraine can bring home to their districts, because it does have an economic impact, particularly in the defense industry, that is significant. So if we need to get there, right, if we need to get beyond why this is actually in our national interest to stand up to Russia and Ukraine, and we need to make it very tangible for folks, we can always, the economic route is a good one to take.
But how can this be done? Specifically,
I'll jump in on this one a little bit. So I was an elected official for 10 years myself, not in Congress, but in the state legislature. And one thing is true at every level of government, that when you're an elected official, what your constituents talk to you about does get your time, right? When they come and meet with you, when they reach out to you. And I know as we head into an election year, I think what Rachael said is absolutely true. It really does usually shift to domestic issues. But for those who care about transatlantic relations, who are in the United States, who are voting in US elections, they can raise these issues directly to candidates, directly to elected officials. I think Ukraine is something everyone will get asked about because it's happening now. But from a broader perspective about transatlantic relations, that is something that it's absolutely fair game to ask every candidate who's running for Congress on all sides of the political aisle in their primaries. And the more you ask about those things, the more you raise them directly as part of the election process, sends a message to the elected official, even if they're not an expert on it, that this is something I need to know about. This is something people I want to earn their vote and want to represent care about. And I can't say enough how underappreciated that mode of connection is to your elected officials, and especially to candidates. They will take those meetings, they will take those calls, and I think it's a worthwhile level of outreach to do that really can make a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just build off of that? The outreach, I think, is really important. A couple of weeks ago, I think when the UN was up in New York, some of the think tanks here in town had discussions and brought in Eastern European ambassadors and officials and whatnot to talk about how important Ukraine was at the end of the day. And you listen to their stories and the perspectives from that region, and they are powerful and they are really strong about what is happening and whatnot. But you realize the audience that they were talking to was all foreign policy people, all DC people and whatnot. So I think from a strategic standpoint, as you look as an international community and a transatlantic community, it's how do you get those stories and messages out to a broader perspective and a broader function? Because I think, as Emily was saying, like when you're a congressional candidate, when you're a Senate candidate, the level of foreign policy decision-making and thinking you do is really done in the moment. When someone asks you the question, when someone in your stakeholder audience raises it to you, someone in your donor community raises it to you, it's more often than not someone like me who is not a foreign policy expert, but you got to get a statement done at the end of the day. So I think from an international community, think about the broader array of people in the decision-making process that comes into effect. Remember, Mike Johnson was a congressman from Louisiana who not a lot of people were paying attention to for all of his time through Congress and whatnot. And now his views on Ukraine are just as important as Joe Biden's, Chuck Schumer's, Mitch McConnell's, and whatnot. And I think that should give us a really good perspective about how we need to be talking about Ukraine, about Israel, about these transatlantic issues to a larger audience.
Yeah, very good point, I think. Thank you. It's probably the last question really I can bring in here. It's a very important day today, not only because of this panel, but also President Biden and Xi are meeting in San Francisco. So here's a question asking if we see, or you guys see, a change in Biden's stance towards China, and what would that mean in the triangle US, Europe, and China? Do we see some broadening conflicts here? Rachel? It's so great to be the moderator. What's these difficult questions?
Isn't it though? I mean, I think what's really interesting from a political perspective on the Xi Biden meeting this week is how how quickly the White House has worked and how hard they've worked to lower expectations on what this is going to be. I think that's significant. I think in their ideal world, it was going to show, have something to show for themselves that they could kind of couple with this meeting, but instead it's been it is not the foreign policy win showcase, I think, that they have been hoping for. So my take, muddling along through that relationship, I don't know that much is going to come from this meeting.
Mm-hmm. But besides the meeting, right, both Republicans and Democrats are really tough with China. Will this change during the campaign? We know that during a campaign, sometimes everything gets a little bit more heated up, and then after a person is elected, they sometimes find a little bit more of a middle ground. But what do we have to expect over the next couple of months when it comes to China? I think that's a question which really concerns many of our viewers and many people in this world. There is the Taiwan conflict looming and all of that.
I will say this, I am not an expert on this, and I want to be, like Joe said earlier, this is not where I spend my time. But I also will say it is something obviously I care about, and that a lot of us care about on all sides of the political aisle. I don't think you will see President Biden's position change unless China makes changes. And I think that's what you're going to hear him talk about. And I think he's been consistent, he's been strong. I think he'll continue to be, and he has no reason to change his position. He's going to always do what's in the best interest of the United States, and he's going to look to hold them accountable in whatever ways he can and make sense, and I think call others to do the same. That's, again, I'm not an expert on this, but I don't expect any major shift unless China starts to make changes on their end, and I just don't see that happening either.
I would also. Oh, sorry. Just quick note.
Go for it, Rachel. Go for it.
Just that China has been kind of a bipartisan bright spot for Congress, even our House of Representatives. The China Select Committee has been by Mike Gallagher is heading that up, and has been a real display of what bipartisanship around an issue can look like, as in the spirit, Ines, of holding up some of those bright spots. But Joe, go ahead.
No, I was to echo what you said, Rachel. I think China is the one bipartisan issue that we have, and being harder on China. And I think the only race that we're probably going to see over the next year in House, Senate, and in the presidential is how tough can one be on China, and how weak is the other candidate on China. So you've already seen Donald Trump and Joe Biden kind of go back and forth on that. That was a Republican talking point at the debate. You'll see Senate candidates who used to be businessmen, all of a sudden get attacked for connections they have to China and so forth. So I do think, and that was true in the midterms in 2022, it is the one just consensus issues that we have, and how can you be stronger on China. That means, just from a policy standpoint, it's a little bit harder for probably the administration to maneuver on that, because everyone will be watching what they do and so forth. So, I do give, the president a little bit of credit this week, with the Xi meeting. It is something that they're going to tout. It's like he is, the statesman, or trying to purport to be the statesman in the room and whatnot. And I think that's something that you'll see as part of his messaging in the general election. But I do think China is our one political consensus issue.
30 seconds each before we have to close, unfortunately. Give us some hope. Emily.
Look, I'm a person who I always say I can be optimistic because I work really hard, right? I think going into next year, we are going to see it's going to be tough, right? But when we get through the slog of next summer and the early fall, I think we're going to see ultimately, I think the House could flip to Democrats. I think that's real. And it's largely due to the inaction of the Republicans. I think the Senate can hold. We didn't really get into the map of the Senate races. They are tough for Democrats, there's no question, but they have really good candidates with good stories to tell. And I'm watching those Republican primaries and sort of shaking my head.
Okay, thank you very much. Rachel,
and I think Joe Biden will be the president of the United States next time.
Rachel, 10 seconds, no, or 15.
Oh, man. No, so a lot of what I look at is like threats to US democracy, which is not the cheeriest of topics. But I will say that going into 2024, we are smarter, we are wiser, and we are more prepared than we were last time when we were talking about election security issues, threats to election officials, potential political violence. These are all kind of things that have been swirling since 2020 and definitely were major concerns in the 2022 midterms.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think we got your point,
Yeah.
better prepared, like more aware really of what could happen and what happened. Joe.
I guess to the point about democracy, this may be the election that nobody wants with the two candidates that nobody wants, but it's the election that we got. We'll wage it. Someone will win. And hopefully by the end of that, they've articulated very clear positions and strategies around the big threats facing the country.
Thank you so very much, Emily, Rachel, Joe, also to our viewers, to the great questions. There are more. That means we have to come together soon again. Definitely a lot to talk about in the upcoming months. All the best to you guys. I pass it on to Giovanni Grevi. He will moderate the next panel. Giovanni, hi, good to see you. We say goodbye and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Very well. I hope you can hear me. I'd like to welcome everybody to this second session in the State of the Union's event. We heard a lot about the complex moment that US domestic politics is going through and the connection between the domestic agenda and events unfolding on the international stage and the various crises that the US administration is facing. Now, what we'd like to do in this second panel is to set the question of the transatlantic partnership and transatlantic leadership in a wider global context, a global context that, as the title says, has been marked clearly over the last couple of years by Russia's aggression and by the risk of a drift towards a regressive world. And of course, the two are connected because here we are thinking of a disruptive event like Russia's aggression of Ukraine, which was preceded by COVID, which was followed now by the war between Israel and Hamas, as a major disruptive event that interacts with a range of global trends that were already weakening, eroding the international order. And that the war in Ukraine and Russia's aggression has exacerbated geopolitical competition, the fragmentation of the international economic order, the global challenges agenda that the war in Ukraine has again contributed to aggravate. And so the question is, are we looking at a tipping point here? Is this war and the combined effect of so many crises on the international level amounting to a paradigm change, shifting from a world of relative progress in the post-Cold War for 2 or 3 decades of relative progress on the political front, on the economic front, in terms of interdependence, in terms of international cooperation and multilateralism, to a world, to a potential risk of regression across the board. Think of the development agenda, human security, conflict indicators, democracy backsliding, the crisis of multilateralism. Are we facing this risk? This is also one of the main questions and findings that comes out of a book that FEPS has published recently, a few weeks back, where the contours of this scenario of a regressive world are sketched out. Now, this is a scenario. It's not a prediction. It's not something inevitable. It's something that leadership can help avert and prevent. And here comes the question about transatlantic leadership. What the European Union, Europeans, the US, on their own and working together above all, can do to avert the risk of a regressive world, address the crisis that we face, push back against Russia's aggression, and flesh out a more positive agenda. This is the underlying question, I would say, to this panel. And I'm delighted, of course, that we have with us 3 very distinguished speakers who will share their knowledge, their experience to help us assess the prospects for transatlantic leadership in this very volatile international context. And so I move on to welcome and introduce them, of course. Belén Martínez Carbonell, welcome. Thank you for being with us, Managing Director for Global Agenda and Multilateral Affairs with the European External Action Service. Alena Kudzko, who is the Vice President for Policy and Programming with GLOBSEC, and Jack Thompson, who is a lecturer on American Studies and focuses on American political culture and grand strategy at the University of Amsterdam. Time is short. I would ask you to make your opening remarks within a few minutes now, each of you, so that then we have time for what I'm sure is going to be a rich debate with Q&A. As in the first session, I would invite participants who like to ask questions to write them succinctly in the chat box, and I will put them to the speaker. So to move to the panel, Belén, the floor is yours. Thank you once again for being with us.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Indeed.
Okay, good, because I have a small voice, a little voice. No, thanks a lot for the invitation, and thanks a lot for the introductory remarks, Giovanni, if I might call you that. And thanks for the clarification that this is just a scenario, because I read not the whole book, but I did read your chapters, and I came out, the last word is regressive world. And, you know, other speakers in the panel today are more think tankers. I'm the kind of practitioner, so I feel a lot of responsibilities over the shoulders of us poor public servants, because even me, who am an optimistic by nature, I've been trying to stay the positive ground over the last year and a half, and it is difficult. So reading about the tipping point and regressive world, I think the tipping point and for some of us and our resilience has been the events in the Middle East over the last few weeks. Because I would say that before 7th of October, I was still in a very positive, despite everything that was going on, in a positive direction, thinking that we could still do something good. But it is clear that after many decades of globalization, integration, the world seems very much fragmenting again, and as you mentioned in your writings, there's a return of protectionism, unilateral sanctions, treaty withdrawals, securitizations of many spheres of our life and our world, economic coercion. So the events since the Russian aggression on Ukraine have shattered a lot of assumptions about what was peace, how the charter, the UN Charter, was being respected or not, and therefore has called into question the capacity of the multilateral system to respond, and the capacity and the value of the multilateral system itself to respond to global crisis or to be of value for anything. As I was saying, the events in the Middle East of the last weeks are putting another kind of layer of questions into that. But going back to when this panel was set up, I think the Russian aggression on Ukraine was a big trigger for all of us, and the EU responded with the three-pillar approach: support Ukraine, isolating Russia and multilateral sphere, not because of Russia, but because we think it's not a positive force in the multilateral sphere, and responding to the global impact. And it's that third layer, the response to the global impact, where we had been doing a lot of effort together with the G7 in particular. I mean, it's the EU 27, but then the G7 and the so-called like-minded, working a lot with the so-called global south, the rest of the world, middle ground, whatever you want to call it, but all those countries that have really come to us and say, we're not interested in taking sides. We might take sides on the defense of the UN Charter, and that is something on which I'm still hopeful, because that was still quite present in the discussions, even in the UN General Assembly a couple of weeks ago, the situation in the Middle East. But overall, there is a deficit of trust. When you have a problem, the first step in the right direction is to acknowledge your problem. And I think we are acknowledging that there is a deficit of trust that's been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. And now with everything going on in the Middle East, but all the accusations of double standards and the perceptions that we have in double standards. That is politicizing even more our efforts to reach out to this group of countries. And as a result, I mean, a lesson that we're taking is that we need to listen more, we need to talk more and have more dialogue. And then when it comes to the multilateral system, we gotta make sure that it's fit for purpose. So we, us, the G7 and others, did a lot of work at the last UN General Assembly week. It was a culmination of efforts of months, putting in efforts on fixing the international financial architecture, fixing the funding for climate, and delivering greater representation for the South with African Union in the G20, delivering of the SDGs. So we have made a lot. I mean, and that you can read it in the Hiroshima Summit communique, in the accession of the African Union to the G20. So we had come, I think, to September with good deeds. But, you know, what is ahead of us is quite challenging. I think I'll leave it there as opening lines. Yep.
Well, thank you very much. And indeed, very useful, because you clearly describe how this international context is very volatile, very challenging, and how action and leadership has to be deployed, indeed, at a transatlantic level, but also in larger formats, in the G7, in enhancing dialogue with other regions and part of the world, in building a narrative that can help us overcome the challenges that we're facing. How are we doing, Alena? I turn to you in mobilizing thinking and action to counter Russia's aggression and to deal with these broader risks and trends that we see unfolding.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I will start by saying that sadly, it seems that what matters in the current world, including for partners who try to establish some kind of the new order or maintain certain rules, is the hard power. And that is probably one of the most uncomfortable transformations that Europe is going through, is the realization that we need to do much better on security. We still try to live in this mindset when we think that security or being a provider of security is an option for us, which we decide to have or not to have. But sadly, it's not an option anymore. And it's a precondition for Europe being able to be both more influential in the world, but also defend the European space against the aggression that we are currently experiencing. So I'll briefly outline where we are on trying to make sure that we actually have means to achieve our goals and what else we can do for that. The first point, and that's the typical criticism of the European Union and the feature of the design of the European Union, is that we are a very slow bureaucracy. And the world is going ahead way too fast than our democracies can digest and than our bureaucracies can digest. So the first point that Europeans would have to find a way forward with is to find a way how to make decisions faster and implement them faster. We're not hopeless. We could see, for example, with the implementation of the European Peace Facility, or with certain decisions to provide weapons for Ukraine, that we can do it. The question now is how to systematize this decision-making and maybe expand it also to a broader set of policies and instruments to move the European security agenda forward. The second point is, of course, the investments into defense and security. We still have ongoing war in Ukraine. It's a war that we think in Europe that has global implications, but most likely, as we can see right now, that besides the United States and countries like Canada or South Korea, there will be no help for Europeans in fighting this war. And Europeans will have to work very closely with the United States to make sure that Ukraine has a chance to win. For that, we need to invest much more than we have been doing right now. It does not mean only that we need to make defense pledges. On that front, Europeans are doing not that bad. The key now is actually implementing these defense pledges, converting them in actual contracts, both with defense industries, but also making sure that the promised reforms are going forward. And the second important part here is that these defense pledges have to be maintained over a year. Again, the European Union can play even stronger role right now. We saw already in the case of Ukraine that there is a lot of space that the EU can play and the role that it can play in coordinating the financial investment, including the area of defense and security. And I do think that there is more space for expanding the functionality of the European peace facility, both in terms of the scale, how much it can do, but also repurposing it and making sure that we can use it not necessarily for Ukraine, but potentially for other countries or parts in the world, depending on where the crisis emerges and where Europe needs to be engaged. Third point that's, of course, very important when we come to defense and security spending is what we spend the money on. The war in Ukraine demonstrated that we need both conventional industrial scale type of capabilities, but we also need much more innovation and investments into emerging technologies. And this is probably the area where Europe as a whole is at its weakest point. We're far behind the trend in terms of making sure that whatever new technology is available can be also utilized in an ethical manner in the defense field. We're very far both in developing these technologies, but we're also equally far in implementing them and making sure that they're applied on the field. And again, we're incredibly slow in doing that. So we're behind all the possible competitors out there, including in some cases even behind countries like Russia. And the final point where I think Europe can play a huge role in providing security, at least in its neighborhood, is doing more in the gray zones of aggression. We had the incidents of the undersea cables being damaged by a Chinese ship, whether accidentally, not accidentally, hard to say, but there will be more and more cases like that where it will be very unclear who is to take the role of protecting and securing the infrastructure, or who is responsible for what and what is the appropriate response. So it will also fall on the shoulders of the European Union to figure it out. And finally, of course, it's clear right now that because of everything that we heard in the first session, the United States will remain an indispensable partner, but it's also a partner who will have less time and less resources to dedicate exclusively to Europe. So Europeans will also need to look for ways how to work with Americans and at the same time, how to work with other partners around the world. Belén talked about the efforts that the EU is putting in working with the countries of Global South or Global Majority, as it's now usually phrased differently. But there's also a set of countries who are middle powers right now, but who are pretty assertively trying to either impose their ideas or to find their place in this new structure. So especially in the shorter term scenario, but also longer term, the EU will have to dedicate much more attention to trying to work out what kind of relations we can have with countries like Turkey, South Africa, Brazil, India, and others.
Well, thank you very much, because you clearly made a case for Europe to measure up to the return of hard power and power politics on the global stage and the conflicts that we face, the need to develop adequate capabilities, but also adequate decision-making processes to react swiftly and effectively. And you closed on a note that I thought related very well to what Belén was saying, the need to engage with others on, in this case, the security agenda primarily, but nevertheless to work closely with the United States in the context of the Transatlantic Partnership, but also join forces and develop partnership with others, middle powers and other global regions in facing security challenges that we are all confronting. So thank you very much for that. Of course, now let's turn to Jack. Jack, what's your feeling from a US perspective mainly? What can be the contribution of the Transatlantic Partnership to this very difficult global agenda, considering the evolution of the US strategic outlook?
Thanks, Giovanni, and thanks also to FEP and GMF for inviting me to speak today. So what I'll try to do is to provide some conceptual and historical backgrounds to much of what was said in the first panel, which focused mainly on the US, and also maybe to complement a little bit more from the US side on what the astute remarks from Belén and Alena. So a lot of commentators are increasingly kind of highlighting the 2024 US presidential election as a potential inflection point. Kind of the growing concern about the willingness of Republicans in Congress, especially in the House, just but a bit more broadly in the Republican Party. And maybe this possibility that Europe will have to bear most of, or even all of the burden of helping Ukraine after the 2024 election. And these are all valid concerns. This is a real danger that needs to be worried about. But the reasons for this they're complicated, they're poorly understood, and they're deeply rooted in U.S. history and U.S. strategic culture. So briefly, really ever since the U.S. Began fighting the British Empire for independence in 1776, there has been a tendency among many Americans to view Europe as a negative external other. In other words, Americans believe that by virtue of their allegedly superior political institutions and social values, the United States was different from and better than Europe and needed to remain apart from Europe, didn't want to be tainted by involvement of Europe. And this version of what you might call anti-Europeanism, this is the key reason that the U.S. foreign policy, U.S. grand strategy until the early 20th century was nationalist, it was unilateralist, and had as one of its key strategic goals avoiding entanglement in European alliances and in European military problems. It was really during World War II and during the early Cold War that the U.S. kind of was able to suppress this more nationalist, unilateralist, grand strategic tradition. It didn't disappear; it was just suppressed. And the U.S. was able to help form NATO and to take part to actually join European security architecture over the long run. But for a variety of reasons, the end of the Cold War, the downsides of globalization, the emergence of a truly multipolar global order, the Republican Party is reconnecting with this earlier version of anti-Europeanism. And this goes far beyond kind of calls to cut back or end funding for Ukraine, or calls for European countries to all spend 2% of GDP on defense as in terms of their contribution to NATO. It means a tendency to focus much more on China, which is echoes of the 1950s and kind of the Asia First strategy, which was very popular in the Republican Party at that point. It entails a deep distrust and disdain for European institutions and values. And so in terms of consequences for Europe, and just to kind of wrap up, consequences for Europe of this re-embrace of anti-Europeanism on the US right. It means real skepticism, especially in the grassroots of the Republican Party, about the value of NATO. And I think we know from pretty extensive reporting that if he's elected next year, Donald Trump will try to sabotage NATO. He may not be able to formally pull the US out, but he will do everything in his power to sabotage U.S. participation in NATO. This kind of reemergence of anti-Europeanism on the U.S. right means hostility to multilateralism really in all forms, whether it's the UN, whether it's the WTO, whether it's multilateral climate efforts. All of these things are in danger because of this reemergence of anti-Europeanism. And then finally, this is an aspect that really doesn't get enough attention. You have really vigorous kind of networking and exchange of ideas between the American right and between the populist right in Europe. This means things like frequent pilgrimages of American conservatives to places like Hungary to see kind of illiberal democracy in action. It means the embrace in France during the 2022 presidential election of kind of this stop the steal conspiracy theory, which originated in the US in 2020. And it means things like Vladimir Putin's very conscious strategic outreach, his embrace of white Christian nationalism as a way to connect with the right in the US and with the populist right in Europe. All of these things kind of intensify illiberalism on both sides and need to be incorporated in our discussions of kind of the future of transatlantic security. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jack, for bringing very clearly to our attention some of the currents into the grand strategy debate in the US and the reemergence of those nationalist, isolationist roots that certainly play a growing role in the American debate and might come actually to affect in very significant ways the foreign policy posture, depending on the results of presidential elections next year. So indeed, as you said, that is a major inflection point, potentially, for the world at large, and certainly for the transatlantic partnership. Now, I would invite certainly the participants to put their questions, but let me start going back to Belén with a question, as we are now facing a set of pretty urgent challenges and more longer term ones. And despite the fact that we are looking in a year term at US elections and the changes that that could bring, at the moment, it seems to me that there is a lot of common ground between the European Union and the US administration on the need to deal with two agendas at once. The geopolitical agenda of geopolitical competition, of hard power for one, indeed, and the shared challenges, interdependence, global governance agenda, because they coexist on the international level, and in fact, they affect each other. In that geopolitical competition detracts attention and resources from cooperation in addressing shared challenges, and not addressing shared challenges makes the international system more fragile and more exposed to the impact of geopolitical competition. So in this context, you having, of course, a very privileged viewpoint on the global and multilateral agenda of the European Union, what would you think are central issues for transatlantic dialogue and cooperation potentially on this larger global agenda, multilateral field in the short term, and potentially, depending on what will happen also next year, over the longer term? What subjects, what agendas would you bring to our attention?
Okay, that's kind of a question that could take us a day to reply. But
one short term, one long term.
Look, in the short term, I think we have seen over the last months, and we're still doing today, a lot on upholding the kind of rules-based international order. So there's a lot of work that goes maybe unnoticed on cooperation in New York, and all the work that happens in the Security Council. There is a lot of work that goes on in Geneva, things like the pandemic treaty. I mean, the kind of broader governance issues, even coordination on election of candidates, on positions on human rights statements, on all the issues in the global agenda, whether it's democracy, human rights, rules-based. There's a lot going on that maybe is not so obvious, but we coordinate and we speak the same language, and has never felt so comfortable. And that's in the short term, very useful. Also in the medium long term, I think the changes that have happened in the World Bank, and they're happening in the World Bank, those will supersede the change of administration. Because, and we actually have the president of the World Bank coming next week to address the EU from the ministers of development, and that vision of the change of the World Bank and what it means for setting certain goals in the way we want to finance climate transition, we want to help third countries, that is something that is going to stay. Because regardless who comes in the US, you're not going to take that away. And then there are agendas that are very important, like artificial intelligence, if I think of one, and where you might have seen there was the summit in London last week called by Sunak, where the EU was there, the US was there, and China was there. And there are issues of importance for the global governance, where I think we're all realizing the risks that they bring, or the opportunities that they bring. And again, there, if we set the right course, and there will be momentum in the coming months, we might set the ground for long-term kind of cooperation, regardless who comes. And I mean, and that will help facilitate a lot of work so that attention can focus in the difficult conflicts that we have at hand, which, as you say, will need most of our energy.
So indeed, very interesting. Also, thanks for reminding us that there are the headlines, there are the debates out there in the media and so on and so forth, but there is also a lot of daily work that happens in the engrenage, let's say, of the international institutions, where transatlantic partners and others actually carry out a lot of work permanently. You mentioned the normative agenda, human rights, you mentioned development finance, the regulation of new technologies, indeed, all aspects where, once again, we are probably facing some bifurcations between a capacity and a willingness to regulate, to establish common rules that reflects values and interests, and the drift towards a much more fragmented and indeed unregulated world, which was probably undermined us all. Alena, you mentioned this point of the importance of Europe to become a stronger security provider in the context of transatlantic cooperation vis-a-vis Russia and other sort of international security challenges that we're facing. At the same time, Jack was reminding us that clearly in the US debate, there are at least some strands of thinking and political statements that go in a different direction, that manifest skepticism as to continuing and deepening cooperation with Europe. What do you think is the most important thing to do for Europeans through the EU, through other frameworks, to strengthen themselves, to enhance their resilience, come what may next year? And come what may is not said because these would not matter. These obviously would have very, very far-reaching implications. And yet, Europe will still be there, security challenges will still be there. What Europeans can do to strengthen their capacity to be security providers, to be more responsible for their security, and also perhaps to talk to those Americans who are skeptical of working with Europeans on the security agenda and persuade them that Europe can be a reliable, a strong partner in dealing with common challenges.
Europe being a stronger partner is actually part of the same package of how to make sure that Americans are more engaged. Because if you look at the rational calculations done by probably a large segment of Americans and the American public, is that if they look at Europe or the war in Ukraine and think that America has to have majority of the burden, they probably think it might be too big of an investment with an unclear outcome for us to even venture into it. But if they see that Europe can pick up the slack, can take up some of the burden, then immediately the calculation on the American side can differ. They will see it as a much smaller investment that will provide also a huge return on it going forward. So for Europe, it's fundamentally important to increase as fast as possible its capabilities to support Ukraine, but also to demonstrate that Europe is actually a credible partner for years to come. To put it bluntly, what's important right now is to spend money on defense. It means weapons for Ukraine, but also when we are talking about Ukraine, it's also important to remember that Europe needs to provide much more in terms of the financial support to Ukrainian budget as such. And that all will count and change the calculations on the American side. But also there was a point mentioned at the first panel that for Europeans, it's important to not only talk to people who are doing foreign policy and security in the US, but try to convey similar messages to of course, broader public, but also to make sure that we convert this message of security economic consideration. We're trying to reach to the people who are, for whom security and defense is not their daily bread and butter, but who are dealing with other issues as well. And finally, and again, I think it's also a little bit adding a different dimension, is that even for a Republican Party, the defense industry is important. And a lot of defense capacities, factories that are producing defense equipment and so on, are located in the Republican states. So I think it's also one of those binding factors that in some degree, not necessarily in the full scale, but it will also be a way to bind Americans into support for Ukraine or support for Europeans. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why countries like Poland or Baltic states are very interested in having as much contract as possible with the American defense contractors to make sure that there is sustainable interest on the American side to invest into their security in the future as well.
Thank you very much, Alena. So, making Europe stronger is an important way of strengthening the transatlantic partnership itself, including at this moment of flux in US domestic politics and debates, strengthening defense links, and reaching out to a broader public, not necessarily only to the foreign and security policy community. I think these are very important recommendations for Europeans to try and navigate this partnership as the US enters an electoral year. But Jack, what do you make of these and other recommendations as to whether and how Europeans can help contribute to the domestic political debate in the US, insofar as at least US international interests and posture are concerned? That is one question. Another question that I had for you goes back to what I think was an important speech that President Biden made a couple of weeks back, around the 20th of October, I think, where he was commenting on the larger inflection point that the US is facing vis-a-vis Russia's aggression, vis-a-vis Hamas's attack on Israel, and the strong national interest of the US itself to respond to these challenges, because these challenges would threaten not only international stability, but the national security of the US. Of course, this was a message directed to the American public in the context of this difficult and polarized debate that we heard about. How effective do you think this sort of argument can be as we look forward to the electoral campaign next year? Thank you.
Yeah, two really important questions. So first of all, I mean, I think what Alena is saying is super important. I totally agree. I think one of the things that we need to, one of the frames that is useful to keep in mind when we talk about the transatlantic relationship is the need to modernize the relationship, the need to move beyond kind of the idea that we had of the transatlantic security relationship during the Cold War, when the US was kind of this, you know, by far and away the stronger and kind of more influential partner, and to try to move in the 21st century to a slightly more, at least begin to move in the direction of a more even relationship where Europe takes on more of the security burden, which I think would be better for both sides, not just. So I mean, I think all of those points are important. That said, the impact on kind of the broader American public of Europeans kind of actually spending more on defense, of actually carrying more of the burden in Ukraine, I think the impact, to be very honest, will be limited, just because, you know, the vast majority of Americans don't really pay much attention to what's happening in Europe, and they certainly don't pay attention to kind of the more kind of fine-grained debates about whether it's institution building or kind of rebuilding Europe's industrial base. I would say a more important reason for Europe to build institutions, to build capabilities, is really to protect itself, because in the long run, in terms of its security relationship with the US, because I think we have to be clear that US engagement moving forward with Europe, with European security architecture, is going to be uneven. There's going to be kind of periods where the US will be more engaged, kind of more multilaterally minded, but there will also be periods when the US is more indifferent, and at times even somewhat, maybe even a little bit hostile to kind of the way that Europe thinks about the world. So that's question one. Question two, Biden's speech. I mean, that was Biden kind of giving a perfect kind of really embodying an internationalist vision of what US grand strategy could be and should be moving forward. And obviously, I mean, as you mentioned, Giovanni, doing his best to kind of to persuade Americans that this is the right vision for how the United States should behave in the world. But obviously, this vision of US grand strategy, it's no longer. I mean, during the Cold War, this was uncontested, right? There was bipartisan consensus that this is the way the United States should interact with the world. It was an internationalist vision. There was disagreement about some of the finer points, but there wasn't really a debate about whether or not the United States should have an internationalist grand strategy. That's no longer the case. You now have pretty influential voices suggesting that the US should really adopt a more kind of nationalist, unilateralist foreign policy. You have some voices talking about things like restraint. So it's a more kind of complicated kind of field in terms of how the US engages with the world, and Biden was, I mean, kind of making an argument for an internationalist foreign policy.
Thank you very much. It seems from what you say, from what I draw from our conversation, albeit a short one, there would be much more to say, of course, that if the international system is facing some headwinds, shall we say, some adverse trends that are eroding potentially some of the foundations of the international order, So the transatlantic partnership faces a complicated prospect, depending in particular on the evolution of the domestic politics in the US, depending on the results of election next year, depending on the convergence of divergence or concerning respective priorities, respective worldviews, really. And yet, it seems to me that a pretty strong case can be made that Europeans can and should do a lot together through the European Union on the multilateral stage. The US can and should remain invested on the international stage, but clearly in terms of critical mass, in terms of outreach, in terms of strong message to the world, in terms of expressing leadership and consistency, as it was mentioned, very important also at this time where multiple crises are sometimes testing the consistency in the eyes of the rest of the world. A dialogue, a cooperation at the transatlantic level is probably going to be all the more important than it has been for quite a while, not least because indeed we face what is at least a scenario of the reversal of many of the achievements that the international community has gained over the last few decades, and therefore again calling for engagement, calling for leadership, despite all the challenges that we're facing, and that this panel has certainly very well highlighted and articulated. So I should thank you very much for your insights, for sharing your views with us, and we are very well on time for me to pass the floor to Laszlo Andor for his concluding remarks. Again, thank you for your views and for participating today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. And I would like to thank everyone else, panelists, but also the audience who participated in this meeting today. I think it proved that FEPS, together with the German Marshall Fund, needs to continue this regular exchange. Some of the friends who joined only today may not know that this is a regular project. Every year, at least once, we get together to reflect on the state of the union, what's happening on this side of the Atlantic, but also on the other side. And choosing November is, of course, aligned on the electoral calendar in the United States. And I'm sure next year it's going to be extremely interesting as well. But now, because of a constantly evolving relationship on the two sides of the Atlantic, this is definitely a very important period to continue this analysis. And it might be just a coincidence, but maybe not, that today's discussion coincided with the publication of a new survey by a European Council on Foreign Relations, which basically put forward a not very encouraging picture, because it shows that a lot of Europeans actually believe that in the next decade, the European Union may fall apart. And also a significant portion of the Europeans believe that in the next decade, the United States may stop being a democracy. So it reflects a deep anxiety of Europeans, but probably this is not only a concern of Europeans, but there might be broader concerns regarding very alarming trends in this period, following a period when we had so many shocks. I don't think we need to go back to the time of the financial crisis, which arrived to the European continent from the Anglo-American world, but also we had subsequently a migration crisis and the Corona crisis, and now the wars, a major war in Europe, but also not so far away from us in the Middle East as well. So I think these surveys probably represent some kind of cognitive dissonance. on the side of Europeans. But when we say Europeans, we shouldn't only think about the citizens, but to some extent, the decision makers as well. I think it's going to be hard for Europeans to absorb concepts like war as an investment. I think we understand why this is more the case in the United States, but I think this is still a difficult one in Europe, especially once we have seen the very uneven distribution of the benefits of warfare. And make no mistake, I think it's quite clear that the profits of the current war are indeed concentrating on the US side, and the costs are concentrating on the European side, not least because the European countries are facing the humanitarian consequences of the war, just like in the case of previous ones like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Millions of refugees have arrived to European countries, and Europe is also paying with a drop in the gross potential of the European economy. And that, of course, raises a question whether this concept, some people would say a fantasy, of the European Union becoming geopolitical, a serious geopolitical actor, is it really sustainable or not? We have seen just a few weeks ago probably the biggest blunders of European leadership in the first reaction to the terrorist attack of Hamas in Israel. Hundreds of officials of the European Commission revolting against Ursula von der Leyen, who again proved that their understanding is just very, very simplistic about the world. So if the European decision-making is just too slow, as it has been mentioned by several speakers, and some of the leaders are not really up to the job, the question really is whether it's a sustainable ambition to turn the European Union into a genuine geopolitical actor, or we would need to leave that role to nation states, obviously the larger nation states in Europe, and we need to figure out some kind of different architecture in the European Union. There's a lot of reflection today about the future European architecture. European political community has been launched recently, and the Franco-German expert group, but also others, have put forward very serious ideas about how to reorganize basically everything in the European Union in the coming years. But I think it's more important also not just to learn about ourselves, but also the United States. I think it's never enough to learn more and more about US politics. There are some people who say that they have seen already so many movies that they know everything about the United States. There's probably an inverted relationship here. The more movies people see, the less they really know about how the United States works, and especially how US politics is working. I detect in the discussion a kind of polarization or a polarized interpretation of the Trump-Biden relationship. At the same time, I think we would need to invest in exploring the similarities, how after the fall of neoliberalism, there's been a path towards economic nationalism. And in this regard, I think the similarities and the continuity indeed is stronger. The relationship with the global south is something which has been pointed out by several speakers today, and I think we have to reflect about this further. And indeed, I think it's important for us to absorb the fact that the US politics is an independent variable. It affects the rest of the world, but it doesn't really receive significant inputs when it comes to an election year from the rest of the world. And that's also why in the next period, we need to continue with more and more exchanges of views and analysis to have this better understanding and hopefully also to shape better policies, at least what concerns the European side. With this, I thank you again, and I wish you all the best for the coming period.